Picture the coldest night you've ever survived, the kind where your breath turns to fog, your bones ache, and the wind feels like it's slicing through your skin. You open the door. No heater, no blanket, no warm light waiting, just silence, darkness, and the snow climbing higher outside. Feels unbearable, doesn't it? For the Vikings, that was just Monday. Winter didn't just visit the north, it ruled it. Long, punishing stretches of endless cold, temperatures diving below 30°C, wind screaming like it wanted to tear the world apart, snow piling high enough to cover entire homes. There was no thermostat, no wall switch, no fleece pajamas to hide in, just people, exposed to the wild, surrounded by a nature that did not care whether they made it to morning. And yet, they made it, not just once or twice, but generation after generation. How? The answer might not be what you think. They didn't just light fires and hope for the best. Fire alone wasn't enough. Wood wasn't always there when they needed it. In some regions, trees were rare, and winter seemed to stretch on forever. If they had depended entirely on chopping logs and stoking flames, they would have perished. So instead, they did something better. Something far more clever. They adapted with a kind of genius that modern survivalists still admire today. They didn't survive the cold. They outsmarted it. Every decision they made was part of a larger system of staying alive. Not just surviving the elements, but bending them to their favor. Their homes weren't just shelters. They were heat traps. Their livestock didn't just provide milk or meat. They became body-warm radiators. Their clothes weren't worn for fashion or modesty. They were insulation, layered like armor against the chill. And every one of these choices was carved out through experience, trial, and cold necessity. Now, when most of us think about warmth, our minds jump to one thing: fire. We imagine a blazing fireplace, crackling logs, warm air rising in soft waves. But the Vikings had another source of heat, one that walked, clucked, and mooed. Their secret weapon against the cold wasn't always fire. It was animals. It might sound strange now, even a bit wild, but back then it was smart. Smart in a way that only those who've stared into long, frozen nights would understand. The animals weren't just visitors, they were part of the home, literally. Inside a typical Viking longhouse, there weren't many rooms. In fact, there usually weren't any. Just one long hall, a glowing fire pit set in the middle, sleeping benches lined up along the walls, and right there, sharing the same air, the same warmth, and sometimes the same straw, the livestock, chickens, sheep, goats, cows, even horses. It wasn't a mess, it was math. A single cow, for example, gives off almost as much heat as a small electric heater. Sheep are like living wool blankets. Even chickens add to the ambient heat. Horses often stayed near the door, not only for warmth, but as a natural alarm in case danger came sniffing around in the dark. But it wasn't just that animals were inside. The architecture made their presence matter even more. Viking homes were engineered quietly, effectively, to trap every bit of that body heat. Animal stalls were often built a step lower than the main living space. That meant the warmth given off by livestock bodies would rise and collect in the areas where the family slept, while the cold air sank and pooled below. No electric fan, no insulation foam, just design and biology, working together like an ancient science experiment. What's even more remarkable is how intentional all of this was. Every element had a reason, a place in the plan. The animals weren't there by accident. The stall height wasn't just a convenience. It was deliberate, thought through, tested by time. These people lived in some of the harshest conditions imaginable, and yet they didn't just hunker down and hope. They solved the problem. And this was only the beginning. What they did next pushed that idea even further. Their homes, those simple wooden buildings, weren't crude. They were brilliant. At first glance, a Viking longhouse might look basic: planks, beams, maybe some grass on the roof. But step inside, or better yet, look closer, and you begin to see the layers, literally. 3 walls thick. That's what they built. Not just one plank wall like a modern shed, but three. Wooden boards inside, a dense middle packed with earth, and another layer of boards on the outside. The result? A wall that breathed, insulated, and held heat like a sponge. Cold air struggled to pass through. Warmth stayed trapped inside. Modern homes still rely on the same principle, just dressed up in drywall and fiberglass. And then there was the roof. This wasn't just thatched straw or loose branches. Viking roofs were covered in thick layers of sod, sometimes more than 2 feet deep. In the heart of winter, those heavy sod blankets acted like earth-grown insulation. They kept the heat in and the snow out. When spring came, the rooftops would bloom with wild grass, blending the house into the hillside like camouflage. Even nature couldn't tell where the Viking home ended and the world began. They even thought about the floor. Cold air sinks. That's a rule of physics. But the Vikings knew it intuitively. So they laid down layers. Straw, birch bark, furs, anything that could lift them off the frozen ground. In some homes, the entire structure was partially buried, sunken into the earth itself, so that the ground's own heat could help balance the bitter air above. None of it looked high-tech, but all of it worked. Inside, while snow blasted outside and the wind screamed against the walls, the temperature could hover around 4 degrees. Or 40 degrees Celsius. That's not warm by modern standards, but it's enough. Enough to sleep, enough to survive, enough to wake up and do it all again the next night, and the night after, and the night after that. Now let's talk about fire, the image we all cling to when we think of staying warm. A big roaring blaze, sparks flying, logs crackling and popping in the hearth. But that's not how the Vikings did it. In fact, most of the time, they didn't even want that kind of fire. Flames that reached high into the air looked dramatic, sure, but they wasted heat and burned too fast. For people trying to make it through endless nights with very little wood, efficiency mattered more than spectacle. Most Viking homes didn't even have chimneys, and that wasn't because they couldn't build one. It's because they understood what a chimney did. Pulling smoke out of the house also meant pulling heat with it. So instead of venting everything out, they let smoke drift slowly through the space, rising toward a small opening in the roof. It was smoky, yes, but warm. The fire didn't blaze. It smoldered, low, constant, steady, a whisper of flame rather than a roar. That glow in the center of the longhouse wasn't just for light or cooking. It was the heart of the home. Its job wasn't to impress. It was to preserve. The beams above it absorbed the smoke, which had a bonus effect, keeping insects away and protecting the wood from rot. Slow-burning embers warmed the room without blowing out the heat, and the air stayed thick, quiet, and warm. But the most surprising fire trick? It came at bedtime. When night fell and the fire burned low, they didn't just rely on what remained in the pit. They had a system. Glowing stones, heated all evening, were pulled out of the coals. They'd wrap them in furs, sheepskins, even layers of wool. Then they'd tuck them beneath their sleeping platforms. Imagine that, an ancient hot water bottle carved from stone, still glowing with heat from the fire. These stones would radiate warmth for hours, quiet, safe, and steady. No flickering flame, no smoke in your face, just heat, trapped and slowly released. Some longhouse fire pits were even carved into shallow cones, designed not to make a show, but to spread heat evenly throughout the space. It wasn't about flame, it was about function. When wood ran low, they got creative, burning blocks of peat, dried grass, even dung. Yes, dried animal waste. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. It burned slow, kept the heat, and stretched out their limited fuel supply through the bitter night. That's what made their system brilliant. It wasn't just about building a fire. It was about managing one. A modern campfire might last an hour or two before you need more logs, but the Viking system turned heat into something that lasted until dawn. They didn't just light fires, they designed solutions. And what they did while sleeping was just as clever. Anyone who's ever tried to camp in the cold knows a brutal truth. The floor is the enemy. Cold air settles low, and the ground becomes a heat thief, pulling warmth from your body all night long. The Vikings knew this well, and their answer? Sleep higher. Their beds weren't on the ground. They were platforms, raised above the floor, some made of wooden planks, others of woven branches layered with straw and fur. By lifting themselves even a foot or two off the earth, they avoided the coldest air. Even better, they got closer to the ceiling, where smoke and warm air naturally gathered. Some of these platforms were wide enough for whole families to sleep side by side. Others were narrow, tucked into corners, curtained off with hides like sleeping pods. Cozy, dark, and warm. Once inside, your body heat had nowhere to escape. It circled, bounced, trapped in that little enclosure like in a cocoon. And under those beds, nothing went to waste. Layers of straw and hides created more insulation, but they also used that space for storage, firewood, food, sometimes tools, all tucked safely where the warmth could reach them. In a few homes, there were lofts, raised platforms built high under the beams, perfect for catching the very warmest air in the room. Picture climbing into one of those beds, high above the cold earth, wrapped in furs, while outside the storm howled and the wind screamed like wolves. To the Vikings, where and how you slept wasn't casual, it was tactical. The placement, the height, the materials, all of it mattered. It wasn't about comfort, it was about survival, and it worked. Now imagine how you get ready for bed on a winter night. You might change into pajamas, climb under blankets, pull up a comforter. Maybe you even have a heated mattress pad. For the Vikings, none of that existed, but they had something better. They became the blankets. Their bedtime preparation didn't mean taking clothes off. It meant piling them on. Tunics made of wool, cloaks lined with fur, undergarments of linen tucked into thick trousers, sheepskin hoods that wrapped around their heads and necks, layer upon layer, each one trapping a small bubble of warm air. Together, they formed a barrier that held heat in like a furnace wrapped in fabric. Modern outdoor survivalists call this the onion method, layers you can adjust depending on conditions. But the Vikings were layering centuries before the term existed, and they did it right. Even their feet got the special treatment. Wool socks, sure, but when things got truly cold, they stuffed fabric scraps with moss, grass, or straw, then wrapped them around their feet like homemade boots. Crude, yes, but shockingly effective. Some cloaks were made from seal skin, which was both waterproof and wind-resistant, like an ancient version of a modern Gore-Tex jacket. Wolf and bear fur added serious insulation for the most frigid nights. Even the way they fastened their clothing mattered. Brooches at the shoulders didn't just look good. They let the cloak hang right and layer without gaps. They made it easy to add or remove a piece quickly. It was part fashion, part function, and all survival. And once the layers were on, they stayed on. The Vikings didn't change for bed. They suited up for it. They went to sleep already dressed for war, against the cold. Wrapped in layers, sealed in fabric and fur, they climbed into those benches like walking, breathing sleeping bags. That's how serious they were about keeping warm. And we know this because archaeologists have found Viking burial sites where the dead were wrapped in those same layers. Fur, wool, linen, all carefully placed, just as they would have worn them in life. The system they used to survive didn't end with death. It was the ritual. The same gear that saved them in the worst nights of winter followed them into the afterlife. But even all of that, the layers, the stones, the fire, the raised platforms, wasn't enough on its own. The Vikings had one more trick, a trick they carried not in their hands or homes or clothes, but in their stomachs, because when it came to surviving the cold, what they ate mattered just as much as what they wore. They didn't eat for taste. They ate for temperature, for energy, for heat. Their meals weren't about pleasure or indulgence. They were about fueling the furnace inside their own bodies. That's what the cold demanded, and they answered it. So, on freezing nights, Viking food looked nothing like the comforting dishes we know today. No hot cocoa, no stew with fresh bread. Their diet was dense, heavy, and absolutely intentional. Fat was the hero. Not sugar, not even meat, fat. Whale blubber, seal meat, fermented fish, barley porridge soaked in lard, bowls of bone broth so rich it turned to jelly when it cooled. These weren't random meals. These were survival fuel calculated to keep the body warm for hours after the fire went out. 1 gram of whale fat has more than twice the calories of a protein bar today. More energy, longer burn, deeper warmth. That wasn't a coincidence. It was a method. Here's why that mattered. Digesting fat takes time. Your body works hard to break it down, and in doing so, it generates heat, internal warmth, spread out hour by hour like an ember glowing in your core. So, when a Viking family ate greasy, heavy meals before bed, they weren't just filling their bellies, they were lighting a fire inside their own bodies, a fire that burned long and low, just like the one in their hearth. Sometimes that meal was reserved for nighttime, a kind of bedtime ration held back for maximum effect. Bone broth, thick with collagen and oil, warmed on the edge of the fire. Fermented meat pulled from storage pits, sliced and shared. In leaner times, they dug into caches of dried fish or scooped underground reserves of buried butter. Yes, butter stored in the soil, wrapped and packed for winter use. Nothing wasted. Everything designed. This wasn't just about having food, it was about using food, turning calories into heat, turning meals into tools. A Viking's dinner wasn't a break from survival, it was survival. And that heat didn't just warm their hands or their bellies, it reached their fingertips, it made them last. And yet, even with fire in the hearth, clothes on their backs, stones under their beds, and fat in their bellies, the cold could still creep in, still sneak through the cracks, still hover just out of reach, waiting for one mistake. But the Vikings had one more answer, the most human answer of all. They slept together, not for comfort, not for bonding, but because the human body, yours, mine, theirs, is a heat engine. A single person gives off warmth like a light bulb glowing in the dark. Multiply that by 2 or 5 or 10, and you've got what scientists now call a shared thermal mass, a cluster of warmth, a breathing, living heat source made stronger by every heartbeat beside it. Inside a Viking longhouse, sleeping alone was rare. Families huddled together, elders, children, partners, all curled under the same fur, side by side, not out of weakness, out of wisdom. The warmth of another body was the most reliable heater of all. Even the dogs played their part. A Viking dog wasn't just a companion, it was a space heater with paws. Dogs curled up beside their owners, not just for love, but for warmth. Their fur, their breath, their steady presence added another layer of protection against the cold. They were more than pets. They were teammates in the fight to make it until dawn. Now close your eyes and imagine it. Outside, snow falls silently. It piles high against the door, sealing it shut. The wind moans, dragging across the roof like claws. Darkness thickens. The temperature drops. But inside, it's not silent. It's alive. A fire smolders at the heart of the house. Smoke climbs toward the rafters. The walls hold in every ounce of heat. The floor is covered in straw and hides. Glowing stones tucked beneath sleeping platforms radiate warmth like quiet suns. And above it all, families lie bundled in fur and wool, shoulder to shoulder, foot to foot. Dogs curled into the curve of their backs. Children nestled between parents, all of them breathing slow, all of them sharing heat. That's not just survival, that's design, that's adaptation. That's what it means to live in harmony with the cold rather than run from it. That's what the Vikings knew. They didn't panic when winter came. They prepared. They didn't just wait for spring. They endured, and more than that, they thrived, because every detail of their night was a system, every habit a solution, every decision a calculation. Animals weren't just livestock. They were heaters. Homes weren't just walls. They were insulation chambers. Beds weren't just for rest. They were pods of trapped heat. Clothes weren't outfits. They were barriers. Food wasn't indulgence. It was fire. And people? People were the last line of defense, the most intimate, the most dependable, and the most powerful furnace of them all. This is how the Vikings survived the coldest nights on Earth. But their story doesn't end there, because winter wasn't the finish line. It was only the beginning. Morning comes slowly in the north. The light is gray at first, barely brighter than the smoke that lingers near the ceiling. The fire in the hearth is low now, just faint red coals under a thin crust of ash. The stones beneath the beds have cooled. The breath of the sleepers rises in small, steady clouds. But something stirs. A hand reaches from under fur. A child's foot finds the edge of the sleeping bench. Someone pulls on boots, stiff with frost. The Vikings are waking up. And they are alive. Not just alive, but strong. Because the night didn't beat them. The cold didn't win. They planned, they endured, and they made it through. And now, even before the snow melts, they're already preparing. Splitting logs, sharpening tools, feeding livestock. These aren't people crushed by winter. These are people hardened by it. Because for the Vikings, the cold wasn't an obstacle. It was training. Every brutal night prepared them. Every clever trick made them more ready. They didn't spend winter hiding. They spent it forging themselves into something tougher, something leaner, something unshakable. So when the ice finally cracks and the rivers begin to move again, they don't stumble into spring. They stride into it. They open the Longhouse doors. They blink into the sunlight, and then they build. They shape wood into oars. They carve planks for ships. They patch sails and stitch lines. The same hands that piled straw on the floor now raise beams to the sky. And when the ships are ready, when the snow has retreated from the coastline, they go into the water, into the wind, into the unknown. Because the Vikings didn't just survive, they sailed. They crossed oceans on boats built by firelight, boats imagined in winter silence and brought to life by hands that knew the price of frostbite. They carried with them not just weapons or dreams, but lessons, lessons carved into every night they spent beside smoldering stones, lessons wrapped in every layer of fur, lessons whispered from parent to child as storms raged just outside the door. The cold didn't kill them. It taught them. It taught them how to live with less, how to burn slowly, not brightly, how to make warmth last until morning. It taught them how to see every object, every plank, every animal, every spoonful of broth, not as comfort, but as tool, as strategy, as part of something greater than survival, as part of life. Because for the Vikings, winter was never the end. It was always the beginning. They didn't wait for comfort. They made it. They didn't chase warmth, they built it. And when spring finally arrived, they weren't weaker from the long sleep. They were ready, ready to row, ready to raid, ready to explore, to farm, to trade, to build, to rebuild. That's what makes the Viking story different from so many others. They didn't rise in spite of hardship. They rose because of it. They turned every cold night into a kind of strength, and that strength didn't stay in the Longhouse. It spilled out, across the water, over mountains, through forests, into history. The same people who slept beside livestock, who ate fermented seal meat, who wrapped their feet in moss and bark, they became explorers, traders, settlers, builders of towns and tellers of tales. They shaped the world not just with axes and sails, but with knowledge carved from the coldest corners of the earth. And if you want to understand them, truly understand them, it starts there, not on the ocean, not in the battle, but in the dark, in the night, in the moment when the fire is low and the snow presses hard against the walls, and you have nothing but your breath and your mind and the warmth of those beside you. That's where the Viking story begins, not with conquest, not with gold, but with survival, with a night so cold it should have ended everything, and a people too stubborn, too smart, too alive to let it. Imagine the sky still gray with melting snow. The ground is soft, not from rain, but from thaw, the kind of thaw that comes slowly, grudgingly, from beneath months of ice. The rivers crack first, then the streams begin to run. The trees drip, the Longhouse doors creak open, and the Vikings emerge. They don't blink like people leaving a cave. They don't stretch like animals waking from hibernation. They move with purpose, with memory, with momentum carried forward from winter's silence. They are already thinking ahead, because winter wasn't just a season, it was their forge. And now, as the snow gives way to green, what was hardened in fire and frost is ready for water and wind. They walk down to the shore, boots pressing into mud softened by melt. Their ships are there, waiting, covered in canvas, stitched with the same fingers that chopped wood by firelight. Hulls carved by candlelight, frames lashed tight by hands that once carried glowing stones across cold dirt floors. These weren't ships built in a rush. They were crafted over weeks, quietly, with care, plank by plank, rib by rib, each one soaked in the silence of winter and the knowledge of survival. Every joint mattered, every knot was checked, because what these ships faced next was just as dangerous as the storm outside a Longhouse door. The sea, not the calm blue postcard sea, the real sea, gray, cold, restless, the kind of water that can flip a boat like a coin, the kind that swallows even strong men and never gives them back. And yet the Vikings went, not because they were fearless, but because they were prepared. They packed the same lessons that kept them alive in the night and brought them aboard. Furs, preserved meat, dried fish, seal fat, barrels of water sealed with pitch, extra oars, extra rope, every item double-checked, every day calculated. They weren't just setting sail, they were stepping into a larger version of the same game they'd played all winter: endure, adapt, survive. Their ships didn't tower like castles. They were long, low, and sleek, built not to resist the sea, but to move with it. The hulls flexed, the keels sliced, the oars gave them control, the sails gave them speed, and when the wind died, they rode, not for minutes, for hours, for days, with the same steady rhythm as their breath inside a sleeping pod wrapped in fur, because they had learned to pace themselves, to push when needed, to wait when wise, to study every wave, every cloud, every cry of a seabird overhead. That's the thing no one talks about. We remember their raids, their battles, their fire and fury, but we forget the silence, the stillness, the listening. Viking navigators didn't rely on compasses. They didn't exist yet. They watched, they felt, they remembered. The way the wind shifted before a storm, the way waves curled near an unseen coast, the way whales surfaced in certain regions of deep water, the way seabirds returned at dusk, always flying in the same direction, toward land. They weren't guessing, they were reading. The sea, to them, wasn't chaos. It was a language, and every Viking knew how to listen. They told stories about islands of ice, about days with no night, about coasts where the land was black and the sand was soft and warm, about cliffs that rose straight from the sea like walls made by giants. Some of these tales were myth, but others, they were memories, travel logs carved into stories, directions disguised as legends, because while the world thought the ocean was the end of things, the Vikings knew better. They saw it as a road, a path to somewhere new. They sailed first to lands close by, the Shetlands, the Orkneys, the Faroes, islands like stepping stones scattered across the sea. Then came Iceland, then Greenland, each voyage a little further, a little bolder. Each success, a message to the next crew: you can go too. And finally someone saw it. Not mist, not cloud, not myth. Land, real land, jagged, dark, distant, unmapped. North America, centuries before Columbus. The Vikings made it. They didn't write it down in glowing letters. They didn't plant flags or carve their names into stone, but they reached it, walked its beaches, breathed its air, built shelters, left tools behind that archaeologists would find 1,000 years later. Not because they wanted to own it, but because they could go. Because winter had taught them how. Because survival had shown them that distance didn't matter, cold didn't matter, risk didn't matter. Not if you knew how to prepare. That's what no one tells you about the Vikings. Their greatness wasn't forged in fire. It was shaped in snow. They didn't carry charts. They carried memory. Not memory written in ink or scratched into stone, but memory passed on, spoken from father to son, sailor to sailor, carved into rhythm, into rhyme, into ritual. The Vikings didn't need compasses. They had stories, and those stories were maps. Not the kind you can fold or frame, but the kind you can feel. One verse remembered where the sun touched the sea at midsummer. Another tracked the rhythm of waves in a certain stretch of ocean. A chant mimicked the calls of seabirds that only nested on a particular cliff. A legend warned of coastlines where the fog eats ships whole. A lullaby whispered the safe hours to land when tides are calm and winds turn. This was their navigation. This was their science. Wrapped in story, soaked in salt, passed down under stars. Because the Vikings didn't need to see the whole world to understand how it worked. They didn't measure distance in miles or leagues. They measured it in days of rowing, patterns of stars, how long the moon stayed full over the stern. They looked up and saw a ceiling that moved with them, a sky that bent gently to their will. And under that sky they moved, not randomly, not wildly, but with purpose, with knowledge, with confidence. They named places that no one else had dared to reach. They left behind traces, not cities or monuments, but tools, fences, fire pits, beads carved by hand. Archaeologists still find them, still brush away centuries of earth to hold them in gloved fingers and wonder. Wonder how people with no maps, no compass, no anchor of modernity crossed that sea and found a place. The truth is, the Vikings didn't just follow the sea. They followed survival. The same instincts that kept them warm through Arctic nights led them across the Atlantic. It wasn't boldness. It wasn't chaos. It was the same kind of wisdom that made them layer straw underfoot and sleep shoulder to shoulder. It was the wisdom of people who watched everything. The curve of a shoreline, the color of ice in the distance, the taste of wind, salt or soil or something new. They stored it all and passed it on. If the ice broke in March one year, they remembered. If the whales swam deeper that summer, they told someone. If the stars shifted their position by a breath's width, they adjusted. Because for the Vikings, survival didn't stop when winter ended. It changed shape. What they learned inside their smoky longhouses didn't vanish in spring. It traveled with them, into the fjords, onto the decks, across the spray. It became part of their sails, their bones, their choices. That's why their ships reached so far. Not because they were chasing conquest, but because they had already mastered the hardest journey of all. The one that happens every single night when the fire dies and the snow presses in, and there is no one to save you but yourself. They had already beaten that. They had already learned that warmth is not a luxury, it's a design. That silence is not emptiness, it's knowledge waiting to be heard. That stillness is not weakness, it's the calm before a choice. And so they chose. To go, to sail, to seek, because after you've survived a night so cold it could freeze the sea, crossing an ocean doesn't feel impossible. It feels familiar. They didn't think of winter as punishment. They thought of it as a test. And like all great tests, it wasn't just about strength. It was about will, about belief, about something deeper than heat or hunger. Because for the Vikings, surviving the cold wasn't only physical, it was spiritual. They believed in a world shaped by forces they could not see, but deeply felt. A world where ice and storm weren't just weather, but beings. Where blizzards had names, where darkness was alive, where breath in the air was not just steam, it was a soul hanging between worlds. Their myths weren't just stories, they were systems of understanding, blueprints for living with chaos. And in the cold, chaos was everywhere. They believed that frost itself was born of a giant, Ymir, a creature older than gods, a being so vast that when he died, his body became the world, his bones became mountains, his blood turned into oceans, his skull, the sky, his flesh, the land, and from his sweat came the first frost. So, when the wind screamed through the trees and ice crawled across the ground, it wasn't random, it was ancient. It was the world remembering itself. And that changes the way you live. Because when winter isn't just weather, but a part of your origin story, you don't fight it blindly. You listen. You respect it. You make peace with it, even as you plan to outlast it. Their gods weren't distant figures in the clouds. They walked the same roads, faced the same storms. Thor didn't just fight monsters. He carried the sky. Odin didn't just rule the heavens. He wandered the earth in disguise, seeking knowledge, sleeping on hard ground, learning what it meant to be mortal. To a Viking, hardship wasn't failure. It was proof. Proof that you were alive. Proof that your story still mattered. So, when they built their longhouses, when they burned their fires low, when they wrapped their children in furs stitched with bone needles, they weren't just surviving, they were practicing devotion. Because in the quiet of the night, when the fire was nothing but embers and everyone else had gone still, they believed that the gods were watching. Watching not for prayers, but for action. Did you share your warmth? Did you prepare your house? Did you earn your survival? Not with wealth, but with wisdom? That was their test. And that was their answer: to live with care, to eat with intention, to treat every scrap of moss or straw not as waste, but as gift, to pass knowledge down, not to protect power, but to preserve life. They didn't fear death. They understood it. It came in the snow, in the wind, in the thin line between enough heat and too little. And because it was always close, they valued everything. A warm stone wasn't just warmth, it was hope. A sealed jar of butter wasn't just food. It was security. A bed beside a loved one wasn't just comfort. It was strategy. This wasn't weakness. This was design, spiritual and practical at once. And when they finally stepped outside, when the sun returned and the earth softened and the air smelled of green things again, they didn't forget what they'd faced. They carried it in their bones, in their stories, in the way they held the oar, the way they lashed a sail, the way they built a new fire on a new shore. Because you don't leave behind the cold. You carry it like a shadow. Not to fear it, but to remember how far you've come. You don't have to live in a longhouse to feel what they felt. You don't need snow stacked against your door to understand what it meant to live the way they did. Because even now, long after their ships have rotted and their names have faded from stone, something of the Vikings remains. Not in museums, not in fantasy stories, but in habits, in instincts, in the quiet knowledge passed down in ways we hardly notice. The way we layer clothes in winter, starting with a soft underlayer and building up with thicker pieces, sealing warmth close to the body. That's not fashion. That's them. That's the onion method, 1,000 years old and still wrapped around your shoulders. The way cabins in the coldest parts of the world are sunk slightly into the earth, insulated with turf, lined with wool, and sealed tight with overlapping planks. That didn't come from books. It came from memory. The same principles used in Viking longhouses still keep people warm in Arctic villages today. Even the way we sleep. Elevated beds, weighted blankets, heated stones disguised as hot water bottles, all echoes, all shadows of the quiet genius that once burned behind wooden walls while the wind howled outside. Their survival wasn't just clever, it was sustainable. They wasted nothing, not heat, not food, not effort. Every choice was optimized. Every gesture was efficient. In the modern world, we talk about minimalism like it's a trend. To the Vikings, it was just life. When you have to carry your warmth on your body and store it in your walls and eat it with your dinner, you learn fast what matters and what doesn't. That's a kind of wisdom we still chase. And their influence goes further still. The Norse concept of preparedness became legend, the idea that survival is not about reacting, but anticipating, that true strength is quiet, steady, unshakable, not the loud kind that boasts, but the silent kind that builds, that gathers, that plans. You see it in survivalists today. You see it in Arctic explorers, in the engineers who design thermal shelters, in the mountaineers who test their gear in sub-zero storms. They all echo the same philosophy: plan ahead, layer deep, stay low, sleep close, burn slow. It's not loud, it's not flashy, but it works. And what they left behind wasn't just technique, it was a worldview, a way of seeing the world not as an enemy to defeat, but a system to understand. When the cold came, the Vikings didn't scream at the sky. They listened to it. When firewood ran low, they didn't panic. They adapted. When the sea called, they didn't wait for calm weather. They read the waves and went. That mindset, calm under pressure, clever in discomfort, creative in limits, it survived. Not because it was recorded in a book, but because it was repeated. One winter at a time, one layer at a time, one family at a time. Now imagine this. A boy sits near a low fire, rolling a stone between his palms. His mother wraps a fur around his shoulders. His father checks the seal on a clay jar of broth. The wind outside sounds like wolves, but no one looks scared. They've done this before. They've planned. They've practiced. And above them, carved into the wood of the beams, is a mark. Not a word, not a name, just a memory, a mark made by fire, by smoke, by time, proof that someone lived here, survived here, endured. That's legacy. Not monuments, not kingdoms, just knowledge that stays alive because it still works. The longhouse is gone now. The beams have rotted. The sod roof has fallen back into the earth. The fire pit is no longer warm, and yet the warmth itself, somehow, still lingers. Not as heat, but as memory, because the fire never really belonged to the wood. It belonged to the people, and the people carried it. They carried it in their hands, in their bones, in the rhythm of how they lived. And when they left their longhouses behind, when they sailed away, settled new lands, crossed new thresholds, they brought the warmth with them. Not the flame, but the wisdom, the structure, the way of being. The Viking fire never died. It changed shape. It left its mark, not in monuments, but in the patterns of life that came after, in how a roof is sloped against snow, in how children are taught to wear layers before asking for heat, in how a pot of broth simmers quietly at the back of the stove on a winter's night, feeding more than just hunger. This is what legacy really looks like. Not statues, not banners, but habits, designs, gestures repeated so many times they no longer seem like history. And it didn't stop with Viking children. When they crossed into Iceland, they built turf houses dug deep into the soil, layered, quiet, warm. When they reached Greenland, they huddled in small stone shelters near sea cliffs, using the ocean itself as a wall against the wind. When they touched the far shores of Vinland, what we now call Newfoundland, they built homes not to conquer the land, but to outlast it. Each new place carried the same quiet echo: survive by observing, adapt without drama, endure without waste. Generations passed, centuries turned, and still that fire, low, steady, unspoken, glowed. In the cold villages of Lapland, Sami herders sleep with reindeer for warmth. In northern Russia, Chukchi families wrap their boots with moss and birch bark to keep the wet and cold from stealing their toes. In the cabins of Alaska, passed from hand to hand down generations, you'll find beds raised high, floors packed with straw, and stovetops warmed with soapstone pulled from coals before sleep. These are not Viking places, but they are Viking patterns. The same logic, the same humility in the face of the elements, the same refusal to panic when the cold comes. And now, even further still, even into cities, into the hum of modern life, the legacy lives on. A backpacker in Patagonia wraps hot stones in a towel to keep warm in a tent. A hiker in the Rockies sleeps in wool even when synthetic gear is available, because wool breathes, insulates, and calms. Tiny home dwellers insulate their walls with straw bales, build lofts for sleeping, and angle their windows for low winter sun. They might not know where those ideas came from, but the fire knows, because it's the same. The fire that once flickered in the belly of a Viking longhouse is now woven into the culture of resilience. It's there every time someone prepares, every time someone layers, every time someone chooses quiet efficiency over wasteful excess. It's not just about heat, it's about the mindset of heat, about storing warmth when it's easy so you can survive when it's not, about sharing your fire when you have it, because you'll need someone else's fire someday too. About treating survival not as drama, but as ritual. And that's something modern life tries to forget. We are surrounded by light, by buttons that summon heat, by climate-controlled walls and heated floors and automatic everything. But when the storm hits and the grid goes out and the temperature drops, suddenly, the oldest lessons become the only ones that matter. Where's the extra water? Where's the backup fuel? Where do we sleep to stay warm? Who do we sleep near? That's when the Viking legacy comes back, not in the form of battle cries or myths, but in the form of preparation, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't wait to be impressed, the kind that listens, because the cold doesn't care if you're modern. The cold doesn't care if you're wealthy. The cold is older than both, and the fire that survives it isn't the brightest. It's the one that burns low, steady, planned. You can see it in the way grandparents check the forecast more carefully in November, in the way old homesteaders still stack firewood in neat rows, even if they also have a furnace, in the way a parent hands their child an extra blanket and says, just in case. It's not paranoia, it's tradition. It's the whisper of old winters carried across time in actions so small they feel like instinct. The Vikings didn't pass on survival tips in textbooks. They passed them in moments. A mother showing her son how to wrap his feet before bed. A father stacking straw beneath the bench, muttering something about the wind. A child watching how the fire is banked at night. Not too high, not too low, just enough to last. Those moments repeated. Those moments survived, and they're still here. You see it when a city loses power and neighbors share flashlights and soup and floor space. You see it when strangers huddle in airports, wrapping jackets around one another's shoulders while the storm outside rages on. You see it in the first snow of the season, when someone lights a fire not just for warmth but for comfort. That's the Viking fire. Not a roar, a glow, a choice to care before it's too late. And so the fire never died. It became a language, a blueprint, a rhythm beneath the chaos of history. And if you listen closely, if you really stop and listen, you can hear it still. In the soft creak of a wooden floor in winter. In the breath that curls from your lips as you step into the snow. In the instinct to draw closer, to sit nearer, to share what you have, because it might be all that stands between someone and the cold. Not just the cold of air, but the cold of fear, of isolation, of being unprepared. And the Viking legacy at its core is this: don't let someone face the cold alone, because you wouldn't have made it without others either. So the next time you wrap a scarf tighter, light a fire early, boil soup that warms more than just your stomach, know that you're part of something ancient. Know that deep beneath the surface of your actions lives a map, drawn not with lines, but with lessons. And each lesson says the same thing. When the cold comes, burn slow, sleep close, think ahead, and never, ever forget where the fire comes from. To survive winter, they didn't need more. They needed to use what they already had better. That was the real secret. Not strength, not brute force, not luck, strategy. Because to the Vikings, everything was a tool. Everything had potential, a use, a second use, sometimes a third. The straw on the floor, not just comfort, it was insulation, bedding, storage, even kindling if all else failed. A cracked bowl, not trash. Catch the rain in it, use it to scoop embers from the fire, flip it over to cover meat drying on a shelf, keeping smoke in and pests out. Ash from the fire, mix it with animal fat. It becomes soap. Sprinkle it on the floor. It keeps fleas away. Rub it on your skin. Disguises scent from wild animals. Even in death, the fire served them. Every object in a Viking household existed inside a loop of use and reuse. Wool scraps became foot padding. Moss stuffed into boots became insulation, and when dried, a slow-burning fire starter. Bones were carved into needles, buttons, hooks, and toggles, and when those broke, they were ground down into powder and added to fields as fertilizer. A seal skin cloak kept you warm by day and served as a ground sheet at night. A single pelt might shelter a child, patch a roof, and eventually become rope. Nothing was just one thing. Everything had layers. Just like their clothes, their tools were modular, multi-use, clever. Because when the cold strips the world down to essentials, the question becomes, what can you make from what remains? And the Vikings had an answer. They didn't ask, what is this for? They asked, what else can it do? That's not just survival. That's engineering. A kind of practical genius born not from schools, but from necessity. Take their lighting, for instance. No candles, not in the way we think of them. Instead, fat rendered from animals was poured into shallow bowls. A strip of moss or dried root served as a wick. The flame was small but steady. It gave just enough light to carve, to sew, to work. And when the fat ran out, they boiled bones, skimmed marrow, scraped grease from the bottom of pans, light from leftovers, heat from scraps, survival from things no one else would notice. And they weren't wasteful because they were poor. They were wasteless because they were smart. When winter might last 6 months, you don't gamble. You plan. You preserve. That meant drying, smoking, fermenting, sealing, burying. It meant wrapping butter in birch bark and sinking it into the cold earth. It meant threading fish onto ropes and hanging them above the fire to cure. It meant salting meat, not for flavor, but for time. Time was their true enemy, because the cold doesn't come all at once. It creeps, day by day, biting a little harder each week. And the Vikings knew that every hour bought by clever planning could mean the difference between seeing spring or not. So they worked with what they had. If the roof leaked, they didn't wait for timber. They packed moss into the gap. If a sled broke, they didn't mourn. They stripped it down and turned the runners into cooking boards. A broken comb, file it into an arrow fletching tool. A shattered pot, grind it to dust and sprinkle it around doorways to repel ants. They weren't superstitious. They were observant. If a thing had weight, shape, texture, they asked how it could serve again. And that included nature itself. The very landscape became their toolbox. Snow wasn't just an obstacle. It was insulation. Pack it against the outside of a wall, and it held in heat. Ice wasn't just a threat. It was storage. Dig a pit, line it with frozen turf, and you had a fridge that lasted until late spring. Trees gave bark for rope, needles for medicine, resin for waterproofing. Even animals gave more than food and heat. A goose feather might become a writing tool. A goat's stomach might become a water container. A horse's tail hair might be braided into strong, weatherproof thread. It's easy to romanticize this now, to call it rustic or noble. But the truth is, this mindset was deadly serious. Because every resource stretched meant one more fire lit, one more child fed, one more blizzard outlasted. They weren't minimalists by choice. They were strategists by demand. And this way of thinking didn't end with objects. It extended to time. How you spend time became as crucial as how you spend fuel. If an hour could be used to mend, to sew, to prep a meal, to repack bedding, to check for drafts, that hour was sacred. Time wasn't wasted, because waste was death. Even conversation had purpose. A child learning to stitch a tear was also learning to stitch a life together. A story told beside the fire was also planting a lesson. A chant hummed while grinding barley taught rhythm, breath control, patience. These weren't chores. They were rituals, repeated not just for efficiency, but for resilience. So that when the day came that the wind howled louder than usual, or the food stores seemed thinner than they should be, there would be no panic. Only action, calm, measured, trusted, because survival was not about fear. It was about familiarity. You already knew how to patch that cloak. You already knew how to warm the stones. You already knew what to eat when the fat ran out, because everything had been tested, repurposed, reimagined. Everything had been made into a tool, and over time, even the people themselves became tools of survival. Not in a harsh way, but in the way that their very presence was functional. Grandmothers knew which herbs soothed a cough. Children learned to gather dry kindling by touch, not sight. Fathers carved spoons that fit the curve of a cracked pot. Mothers turned scraps of linen into bandages. The elderly passed down quiet wisdom like fire passed from ember to ember. No one was idle, because no one was useless. Even rest had purpose, because rest restored. And they knew, if you don't preserve yourself, all your tools become nothing. So when the snow rose and the winds blew and the days shortened into long nights, they didn't wait for rescue. They became the rescue. They made their lives out of strategy, out of repetition, out of quiet genius. Not all of it survived in artifacts. Most of it didn't survive in writing, but it survived in patterns. And if you look closely today, you can still find it in a homemade repair that works better than the original, in a parent teaching their child how to fix something instead of replacing it, in the way someone takes pride in saving scraps, in turning leftovers into dinner, in boiling bones into broth, in patching socks with yarn that doesn't match. It's not about poverty. It's about philosophy. It's about respect, not just for objects, but for time, for energy, for effort. That's what the Vikings left behind. A blueprint, not just for buildings, but for behavior. A way of thinking that says, everything can be a tool, you just have to look twice. When the wind is still and the days are long, it's easy to forget what winter demands. It's easy to forget how heavy the dark can feel, how quickly the cold steals energy, how slowly time moves when the sky turns white and the world pulls back beneath layers of silence. But winter never forgets. And the Vikings never let themselves forget either, because they understood something that few today remember. Winter teaches what summer forgets. It teaches patience. It teaches attention. It teaches preparation. In summer, you can afford mistakes. You can leave a tool outside and it won't freeze. You can walk barefoot and the ground won't bite. You can leave food uncovered and the sun will still feed you tomorrow. But winter doesn't forgive. Winter remembers. A missing log in the fire pile becomes a freezing night. A torn seam in a cloak becomes frost on your skin. A forgotten chore becomes a problem that cannot be undone. So the Vikings learned to remember before winter arrived. They didn't wait to be cold to seek warmth. They didn't wait to be hungry to prepare food. They didn't wait to be lost to learn the way. Every lesson they learned in winter became a part of them. Because that's how memory works when survival depends on it. It settles into the hands, not just the mind. It becomes instinct, muscle memory, a whisper passed down through repetition, not just words. That's why Viking culture was oral. Not because they lacked writing, but because spoken memory lives longer. You don't need paper to survive. You need rhythm. You need stories that repeat, anchor, circle. Songs to count the hours of light. Rhymes to teach which herbs soothe a fever. Proverbs that tell you when the seals return, when the snow begins to soften, when the wind is lying to you. These weren't just poems, they were manuals, tuned to the seasons, tuned to the body, tuned to survival. And winter was the final exam. Summer might make the world seem easy, but winter shows you who was paying attention, because the dark doesn't care if you're clever. It only cares if you're ready. That's why Viking children learned to sew before they could run far. Why they helped pack straw beneath the sleeping bench, even when it seemed like a game. Why they were told stories not just to entertain, but to train. Because memory wasn't luxury. It was armor. Armor made of repetition, observation, and respect for the world outside the door. You see, the cold didn't just test their bodies, it tested their systems, and it revealed weakness. It showed you which joints of the longhouse needed reinforcement, which cracks in the wall let in wind, which relationships could be trusted when nights stretched long. Winter revealed everything, and in doing so it refined everything. It carved off the unnecessary. It burned away the shallow. And what was left after the snow, after the silence, was real, useful, true. Even today, in parts of the world where the seasons still turn hard, people remember differently. In Alaska, elders teach by demonstration, not lecture. In Iceland, stories are passed around tables during storms while waiting. In Greenland, children are told what the ice looks like when it's trickier than it seems. Because some lessons you can't learn on a screen. Some wisdom only lives in winter. And when the sun comes back, it's easy to pretend those lessons don't matter. To trade preparation for distraction. To trade presence for noise. But the Vikings didn't do that. They carried winter with them. Not fearfully, but gratefully. Because winter had taught them what summer hides. That everything breaks eventually. That nothing lasts unless it's built with care. That warmth means more when it's earned. And that memory is not about remembering what happened. It's about preparing for what might happen again. That's why their culture endured. Because they trained not just their bodies, but their minds. They repeated what worked. They tested what didn't. They adapted. And they remembered. Winter forced them to choose what mattered and to keep only that. It's why their homes were simple but strong, why their meals were heavy but efficient, why their traditions were few but unshakable, and why their stories still hum in the bones of people who've never seen snow. Because winter wisdom crosses time, crosses oceans, crosses bloodlines. It lives in the moment someone says, "Let's bring extra, just in case." In the hand that checks a window before sleep, in the voice that reminds a child, "Layer up." In the mind that plans before trouble arrives, not because they expect failure, but because they honor the past that taught them what happens when you forget. The Vikings didn't worship suffering. They just didn't waste it. They learned what the cold had to teach, and they kept those lessons close, wrapped them in fur, slept beside them, and when spring came, they didn't forget. They passed them forward. The longhouse was never just a building. It was never just a roof over their heads or a barrier against the cold. It was something more, something quieter, something living. It was warmth, yes, but also memory. Protection, yes, but also presence. It was where bodies rested, but more than that, it was where souls returned. Because to the Vikings, the longhouse wasn't just shelter. It was the center of life itself, and like the fire that glowed at its heart, its warmth wasn't only physical. It was emotional. It was ancestral. It was where everything returned when the world turned cold. Step inside a longhouse, not just with your feet, but with your imagination, and you'll feel it. The way the air holds smoke, not thickly, but gently, like an old smell that knows it belongs. The way the beams creak, not in protest, but in rhythm, like old bones shifting during sleep. The way the darkness doesn't threaten, it protects, wrapping every object in shadow, but never swallowing them completely. Everything inside that house matters, because everything inside it has earned its place. The bench beside the wall where a mother gave birth 3 winters ago. The tool rack, smooth from the hands of a father who carved with it until he couldn't anymore. The fur at the doorway, stitched by a grandmother whose voice still lingers in the lullabies hummed at night. The longhouse was not built with instructions. It was built with memory, layered with habits, stitched with patience, reinforced by generations. And at the center of it all, always, the fire. It didn't just warm the room. It measured time. It was how you knew the day was ending, how you knew the stew was almost ready, how you knew someone was still awake, tending the coals, watching. The fire was presence, and the longhouse was shaped around it like a heart is shaped around a heartbeat. But it wasn't just about the fire itself. It was about what happened around the fire. Stories, planning, stitching, grinding grain by hand, telling tales of giants, of ancestors, of lessons passed down, not because they were perfect, but because they were true. This was where children first heard their names spoken with meaning, where lovers whispered during storms, where grief was shared not loudly but steadily, a bowed head, a silence that meant, we carry this together. Because the longhouse wasn't just wood and roof and straw, it was togetherness. And that's what made it sacred, even in a harsh world, even surrounded by ice and hunger and threat. Inside there was order, there was care, there was rhythm, shoes placed near the door, tools stored in their right spot, furs shaken out and fluffed each morning, not for comfort, but because comfort keeps you alive. This rhythm wasn't luxury, it was strength, because outside the world could change in hours. A thaw could become a blizzard. A quiet sky could darken in minutes, but inside you had control. Inside you had meaning. And the longer you stayed in that rhythm, the more the longhouse began to feel less like a structure and more like a person. Protective, familiar, breathing. Every sound it made was known. Every creak had history. Every draft had a memory behind it. A night someone forgot to patch the wall. A story someone told while fixing it. A laugh that followed. Even its darkness had depth, because they didn't flood the longhouse with light. They let the shadows linger. Not just because candles were precious, but because shadows softened things, turned the rough edges smooth, made the fire glow brighter, made a whispered story feel more sacred. The darkness inside wasn't fear. It was rest. It was focus. A way of tuning the world down so the things that mattered could speak more clearly. A mother's hand brushing a child's hair, the scratch of a carving tool on bone, the slow bubbling of broth over coals. This was what it meant to live inside the longhouse. Not to hide from the world, but to build your world from the inside out. And that's why it hurt when someone died, not just because they were gone, but because their rhythm left the room. Their space by the fire felt quieter. Their breath no longer added to the shared warmth. So the Vikings marked it with silence, with ritual, with fire. Sometimes ashes were buried beneath the floor, so that the one who passed could remain part of the warmth. Other times, their tools were hung by the rafters to remind the next generation whose hands once held them. The longhouse became a living archive, and over time it carried more than stories. It carried spirit. That's why people returned to it, not just at night, but in moments of fear, of change, of doubt. Because even if the wind had changed, even if the snow fell heavier this year, the walls were still here, the floor was still warm, the fire was still breathing, and that was enough to remember who you were. The longhouse didn't just protect your body. It restored your soul, and even now, even centuries later, that feeling isn't lost. It survives in how we light candles when the power goes out, in how we gather around a stove during winter storms, in how we build homes that feel a certain way, warm, soft, grounded. We don't just want insulation. We want safety. We want memory. We want rhythm. We want walls that know us, floors that forgive creaks, a space where we can let the cold press in, but not touch us. That's the soul of the longhouse. And it never really left. It just changed its form. Sometimes it's a living room where everyone drops their phones and listens to one story. Sometimes it's a tent shared by strangers who become friends because they share fire. Sometimes it's a voice in the dark saying, "I'm still here," when the world outside feels too big. We still need the longhouse, not for its beams, but for its meaning. The meaning that says, you don't have to face the cold alone. You don't have to survive in silence. You don't have to forget. Just come closer. Let the fire speak, and let the walls remember.